Donald Ray Pollock is kind of like my literary dad, and funny enough, he's actually a year younger than my real dad, but sometimes he looks like this when I haven't sat down to get my words in for the day, and other times he looks like this when I have. But needless to say, he's been a massive influence on my own writing. Not that I've ever written Southern Gothic, even though, ironically enough, I'm writing a short story right now. Hopefully, I'm going to get into an anthology. We'll see if the editor finds something interesting in the story I'm creating. I first discovered his work with his novel, The Devil All the Time, actually his second novel, and it just was something else. I'd never experienced anything like it. The most depraved, gross, and beautiful characters that you'll ever meet in a story, and I don't know, I was just swept away. And so later I picked up his novel, his debut novel, Knock 'em Stiff, which is a very short book. It's like an anthology where it's a collection of stories that are somewhat interlinked, peripherally, I guess. It takes place in a very small location. And just like The Devil All the Time, it is populated with some of the most fascinating and gross characters that you'll ever meet. The beauty in his character work, and I'll talk about it more when I get into the review, is that it's just so multidimensional. You could so easily get into the realm of caricature, but he balances it so beautifully. Another thing to note is that he was a blue-collar worker for most of his life, working at a paper mill, and he didn't get into writing until I think he was about 50. That's when he stopped. If you've ever heard the advice from a writer that says you must live, you must go out and live and take these experiences to become a great writer, this is the man. This is the man who embodies that, because he lived a full life before he sat down to pen his first novel. And of all of his 3 books, The Heavenly Table is probably his weakest novel, but that does not mean it is a terrible novel. That does not mean it's even a bad novel, not even close. It's a great novel, one that kind of blends the concepts that he developed with Knock 'em Stiff and The Devil All the Time, which I will get into shortly. But first, what is the hook? What is The Heavenly Table about? In 1917, somewhere between Georgia and Alabama, Pearl Jewett and his 3 boys, Cain, Cobb, and Chimney, scrape by farming the lands of others. A tragedy sends the 3 boys out on their own, veering them into an unintentional life of crime. Several hundred miles away, Ellsworth Fiddler copes with his life savings being swindled from him and his missing son. And these 2 narratives weave into something far more complex that celebrates themes of violence, love, loss, and even forgiveness. So what did I think? Well, let us begin with character. And before I dive into the main players in the story, it's important to note again that Pollock's character work is just, it's fascinating. It's some of the best I've ever read. And really what makes it shine more than anything else is not just the depth he goes into, but it feels like they just have a life off the page. Some of these characters you'll only experience through very brief scenes or even just one chapter, and that is it. But they feel real. They feel so real, which makes the world feel real. And again, that's Donald Ray Pollock's biggest strength, is he's able to create such an array of characters, but make them so distinct. And it's really a reminder that when you're reading books, a lot of times, you'll notice that characters are serving a purpose. You're like, okay, I get why this guy is here. He's serving the purpose. He's the threshold guardian for those of you story nerds out there. Or he is the mentor, or he is something else. Donald Ray Pollock doesn't really do that. I think he subconsciously does that, right? Because these people will fit these archetypes. But man, he throws some in there that just really come out of left field. And the beauty of their stories aren't really revealed until you get to the very end. And it's such a ride. Reading his books and his characters are such a ride, because you'll be laughing, you'll be tearing up, you'll be cursing them, hating them, whatever it may be. You may be grossed out by them even, which is a very common theme that he has. That's another funny thing about his characters and his stories, is that he seems like just a regular dude, but man, he writes some of the grossest stuff you'll ever read outside of a horror novel anyway. So we begin the story with the Jewetts. Pearl Jewett is the father. He has 3 sons, Cain, Cobb, and Chimney. The dad is exactly what you would think. He's kind of a hard ass, you might say. They're all working the land. They're living in squalor. His wife died in a very interesting way, which I'm not going to spoil to you. It has some of the craziest symbolism maybe, or meaning to him that really stuck with me. But after she died, their family just kind of fell apart. And so they went out working, trying to find work on these farms. And they're dirt poor. They all live in this little shack with a dirt floor. They're eating the remains of this diseased, rotten hog, as well as other scraps that they can find, or that the guy who hired them to do the work is going to give them. I think it's important to talk about the title, The Heavenly Table, at this point too, because they're starving, they're hopeless, and Pearl, the father, he he tells them the story about the heavenly table, right? When you die and go to heaven, you will feast upon this great banquet of all the food you can think of. And he's instilling hope in his children, even though he seems like a hard ass. He is a hard ass, but he's still giving his sons reasons to go on, right? Reasons to go out and seek their own lives. And speaking of the boys, those are their real names. Yes, Cain, Chimney, and Cobb, all of which have stories behind them, right? So I'm not going to spoil that for you here. Just know that those names are purposeful. They're not nicknames. They're actually their God-given names. And speaking of roles, these three boys serve roles, definitely. So Cain, he's the oldest one. He's kind of a leader. He's a straight shooter. And you have Cobb, who's kind of mentally handicapped. He's a little bit slow, and he's really the heart. He's the heart of this group of characters. Then finally, you have Chimney, who is the wisecracking smartass, but he's really damn good with a gun, he finds out a little bit later in the book. So he's kind of the fire, right? He is the fuel that may cause everything to completely burn down. But these three boys, they get mixed up in the criminal world. It's totally an accident. This event unravels into something far greater, sending them all three out on horseback with wanted posters. Everybody's trying to hunt them down. Their legend is growing and growing and growing as they get deeper and deeper and deeper into trouble. So that is kind of one tine of this fork. The second one is Ellsworth Fiddler and his wife and his missing son. So he's a guy who's been swindled of all of their life savings. I think it was like $1,000, but some guy came to him saying he was going to sell them all these cows for a great price, and it turned out that the cows were owned by somebody else, and that guy was off on vacation, and this guy stole the cows and then sold them. Anyway, you get the picture. So on top of losing their life savings and disappointing his sweet, sweet wife who sticks by him no matter what, their son, their good-for-nothing son, goes off, he disappears before killing his mom's cat accidentally, allegedly, with a shotgun. But despite all of this, despite his kid being an absolute asshole and running off and just causing all kinds of trouble, Ellsworth still elevates him. He's his son. He holds him in this light that despite all the stuff he's gone through, and he rolls over that in his head over and over and over again to try to convince himself otherwise, he goes out and searches for his son. But this is where the story begins, these two paths. However, it branches off into something completely bigger, something completely different. But before I go into that, I want to illustrate a certain character in the story, just to give you an idea of what kind of side characters that Donald Ray Pollock will create. This character is named Jasper, and he likes to refer to himself as a sanitation inspector, even though all he's really doing is cleaning outhouses. Yes, he is shoveling shit. And he goes into a lot of detail about things he's seen, like having to fish out live babies from these outhouses, as well as dead babies. You have an interesting character who thinks he's more important than he really is, but he definitely is important. He's walking around these towns just shoveling shit the entire time. So I'd like to add his next trait, which is he has a Johnson that is so big that he can only get it to half-mast at best. And this physical quality he has, his attribute he has, you might say, was ridiculed by his highly religious mother, saying it was the devil's work, and so this hangs over him greatly. Hangs, I probably could have chosen a better word, or maybe that's the best word. And because of that, he kind of abuses himself. His mother has died. He's about 27, if I remember correctly. And he lives at home. He lives in their empty home, but her ghost, or threats, are hanging over him the entire time. And so he's berated from the other side, as well as berated for what he does, what he has dedicated his life to. But despite all that, as I said, he holds himself in a high regard. So you can see here the kind of depth that Pollock puts into his characters. This guy is not a main character, he has nothing to do with the main plot. He bumps into a couple of the main characters in the story, but that's it. And this is just one of at least a dozen characters in this book, if not more. And each and every one of them has this kind of care put into who they are. Okay, let us talk about plot next. So as I mentioned, we have the Jewetts, we have the Fiddlers, and these are the two storylines that we begin with, kind of flip-flopping between chapters here and there, and then it kind of just goes somewhere else entirely. We start to live with these other characters. There's this other guy who was dumped by his girlfriend who joins the military because he thinks that's the best thing to do because World War I is on the horizon. But he doesn't realize he's gay until he sleeps with this maid/prostitute, and probably in some of the most harrowing detail you will ever experience in a sexual encounter in a book. And that kind of directs the story around this map, right? The Jewetts are heading north to Canada to try to escape the crimes that they've committed, when in fact, as I mentioned earlier, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And they're bumping into these characters all along the way, and those characters are bumping into them. So it's kind of like this crazy, chaotic pinball machine of a story that does at one point feel kind of chaotic. So as I mentioned, you have these two storylines that kind of just turn into a spaghetti. And you're wondering what the hell is going on here? where are these going? And I will say that the Jewetts and the Fiddlers are definitely still the highlights, still the focus of the story, but sometimes Pollock drifts quite a bit. And I think that's where people might lose track of things a little bit, or maybe get a little bit bored, because whereas his first novel, Knock 'em Stiff, was completely an anthology novel where it was unrelated stories with the exception of the proximity where the characters were. And then The Devil All the Time, which was a pretty big cast of characters but had a singular narrative. Everything was bleeding together. It was kind of an exploration of causality. And this one is a mix. So on one hand, you have a very forward-moving story that kind of gets mixed up into this anthology-like scenario, but then does come back beautifully at the end. So toward the middle, I guess I was a little bit, I don't want to say bored. Bored is the wrong word, but kind of confused, wondering where the story is going to go. Because I think as we read or we watch movies, we're always trying to orient ourselves. We're trying to navigate where the story is going. Not necessarily guess where it's going to go, but feel like we're on a road of some kind that is going somewhere. But even with this shortcoming, I had an absolute blast with this book. Like I said, the characters are what keeps me going, and Donald Ray Pollock creates some of the best. I rarely laugh out loud in books, and I found myself laughing out loud numerous times in this, but also it's incredibly tragic. It's incredibly sad, incredibly gross. But Pollock is playing with all of these themes, all of these ideas, and he tends to really make everything rise to the top. And I think that's the mastery that is depicted here in his writing. Is that on one hand, you're reading about Jasper, the guy with the big Johnson, and all of his woes and the weird things he gets up to. But then you get to the end and there's this tender moment that really illuminates exactly the kind of person he is. And I probably should have talked about this in the character section, but I think, again, one of Donald Ray Pollock's strengths in characterization is that it never feels like he's making fun of people who are like this. It never feels like he's talking down to them or trying to preach or trying to make an example of them, because he always at the very end shows what truly lies within us all. No matter how dark we can be, there is something there. There is a sliver, a shred of humanity. And I think that's what I appreciate most about his writing. And speaking of writing, let's talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. So this is interesting. You don't really see this that often. So this is what I like to call head hopping. Now, normally in books, as we read them now, you tend to segment POVs into chapters or scene breaks. Donald Ray Pollock kind of does that, but he also head hops within the same scene. So I listened to this audiobook, maybe 25% of the book, and then I think I probably read actually the prose, about 75% of it. And it was a little bit difficult for me to orient myself when I was listening to it, because he does these techniques where he's bleeding into one head from another. And so you may start a chapter or a scene with one character. Within the middle of that scene, he will get in the head of that person. Now, this isn't Frank Herbert's Dune crap. I hate that stuff where you're literally almost line by line back and forth as a dialogue exchange, going into one head and then the other, to where there's absolutely no tension in the scene. You know everybody's motivations. That's not like that here at all. It's completely purposeful, but I would say that would be the one thing that could potentially rub readers the wrong way. But once you get it, you get it. And once you can look out for it, it's not so jarring. But other than that, he captures the Southern voice just beautifully. Not just the dialogue, but it's the narrative itself, which is incredibly important to convey the thoughts and the observations of other characters. I like to refer to Donald Ray Pollock as sort of the more accessible Cormac McCarthy. Extremely readable. It has a depth to it, but it's not clunky, right? It never gets overly poetic. Cormac McCarthy, as much as I love that guy, can sometimes go off the deep end with the poetry. But Donald Ray Pollock, he keeps it firmly seated in the readable realm. And so that's why I always tell people, if you like Cormac McCarthy's themes and his characters, totally read Donald Ray Pollock, because he's going to give you that feeling, that sense, that setting, that culture, and probably even deeper than Cormac McCarthy will, because again, his cast of characters is far larger than anything I've ever read in a McCarthy novel. Which is why I'm going to give The Heavenly Table by Donald Ray Pollock an 8 out of 10. A gritty, horrific, grotesque, hilarious, heartfelt story full of characters that will just leap off the page at you and live off the page, with a plot that starts off very focused and kind of loses its way before it comes back together again, with writing that makes this story full of people that live and breathe, which makes this an incredibly enjoyable book to read. So I highly recommend it. Go pick it up. Go read all this stuff. I can't recommend Donald Ray Pollock enough. Knock 'em Stiff, The Devil All the Time, both fantastic novels. But did you read The Heavenly Table or any of his other works? I would love to hear about it, because clearly I'm a fan. And if you would like to check out my own work, my own writing, check out the link in the description. And thanks for watching. And thanks for hanging out with me. And I'll see you in the next one.